So we're dedicating this year to the refuah of Leah Bas Esther and all the Cholim Klal Yisrael. And Kev, I still think about your mom every day, and please God, she makes a full refuah. I'm very, very fond.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, so the next thing is setting an appliance to operate in one's home on Shabbat. Question is it permitted to use a time clock to operate a home appliance such as a radio on Shabbos? And Shulchan Aruch rules that it is permitted to operate a windmill late Friday afternoon, even if it will continue to grind wheat on its own during Shabbos. This is permitted because no forbidden Shabbos labor is being performed by a human being, only by a machine, and one is permitted to allow the machine to work for him on Shabbos. The Ramah, however, rules that lechatchila, this should be avoided, since allowing a windmill or any other noisy machine to operate on Shabbos will cause zilzul Shabbos, which means a degradation of Shabbos. The Ramah is concerned that running a noisy machine on a Jewish-owned premises on Shabbos casts suspicion on the owners of the premises. Is he desecrating Shabbos? Based on the above, contemporary poskim rule that one may not leave a radio, tape recorder, dishwasher, DVD player, MP3 player, and TV on, a dryer, or any other machine appliance that generates noise in one's home, even if it was started before Shabbos, or if it was turned on by a Shabbos clock. This applies even if the machine emits a low-level noise. As long as it can be heard by a neighbor or a passerby, it is forbidden. Okay, let's leave it at that. Well, there's a bit more on this. So let me sound off on that of the first part, Damon. Okay, Gavin?
Thanks, my friend.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, right. So, guys, let me just tell you where we are up to. I'm just going to, a couple of you were not well, you're feeling a bit moggy, going to run through it quickly. So the Gemara answers, in order to try and reconcile Rav Yochanan's opinion, who is not going with the anonymous Mishnah. And we learned that Rebbe, who redacted the Mishnah, said it has to go with the anonymous opinion, and that's exactly why he didn't give the name of the Tana Kamma of that anonymous Mishnah, because otherwise you could say, oh, it's this rabbi's opinion. We can disagree with it. There are other sources. So the whole reason it's anonymous is that there's a consensus to follow it once it's anonymous. So it's difficult to understand how Rav Yochanan could disagree with that. And then you've got an issue in saying, but the statement with the discrete ones who basically place down the coins and say whatever was picked from this shall be consecrated on those coins, that's in Ma'aser Sheni, chapter 5, verse 1, is also the issue where that anonymous Mishnah is finished by Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and we say, well, Rav Yochanan could perhaps argue with him because he's not anonymous. And we say, no, that's not the case, because if you remember, according to Rabbi Bava Kamma, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is always followed. Even Rav Yochanan agrees, except in 3 cases, which obviously don't concern us. The one with regards to the law regarding a guarantor, the divorce get that was given in Sudan, and a latter case of evidence admission that was discussed in Sanhedrin. But apart from all those other cases, we follow Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, including Rav Yochanan. So we've got an issue that he seems to apparently contradict that anonymous Mishnah in the commentary by Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, because basically the discrete ones turn around, and in order to make sure that those that steal from the vineyard are not transgressing not only the act of theft, but the act of eating consecrated items that are meant to be taken to Yerushalayim and Eden, which is not allowed. So they deconsecrate it with coins and then take those coins to Yerushalayim to buy produce there, because the first 3 years you can't have those fruit products except on the 4th year once they've been redeemed. So we're sitting with the problem. So that what we learned yesterday is maybe the Gemara suggests that we've got to look at the tense. Is it past tense or future tense in terms of how the statement is made? So the Gemara said, they said, do not say that the Mishnah reads the discrete ones, place down the coins and say whatever was picked from this vineyard, because when you're saying that, the term was picked denotes that the discrete ones were actually redeeming the fruits after they had been already picked and stolen by those passers-by, when they were no longer in the possession of the original owner. And the problem with that is Rav Yochanan said, well, if they're not in the possession of the original owner, then a person can't decide to almost let go of something that's stolen because it's no longer in his possession. Because remember, the word forgive in English means to give over, and you can only give over something you have. You can only sell something you have. You can only use something that you have. So if you remember, Rav Yochanan said it doesn't belong to the original owner once the thief's taken it because it's not in his possession. It doesn't belong to the thief because the original owner hasn't despaired of getting it back. So there's a problem. So how can the discrete ones then, when passerbys steal fruit, turn around and say after the fruit was stolen, we let it go. We will use coins now to deconsecrate that and take those coins to Jerusalem to buy produce there, because you would need possession of the original fruit in order to do so. If it's stolen, how's that possible? So the Gemara proposes that instead of the Mishnah saying at the end of the day that the discrete one said it after the day's assessment of what was stolen, they actually make that declaration before it was stolen. So it says, rather say, whatever will be picked from this vineyard. Okay? In other words, the term will be picked denotes that the discrete ones were redeeming the fruits. They would be picked and stolen by the passerbys. So the fruits were still in the possession of the discrete ones when they redeemed it. So the practice of the discrete ones therefore does not contradict Rav Yochanan's ruling that the original owner of a stolen article cannot consecrate it because it's not in his possession. So they're saying that's the only way that you can reconcile it is to actually change when the discrete ones made the statement. And it has to be within their possession in the beginning of the day, and say whatever will be stolen, not after that day. This is what was stolen and we forgive it. Okay, so it actually sounds like a pretty good idea, except the Gemara has a problem. It's going to come to the conclusion and say, well, how can you reword things in the Mishnah? Whatever tense it is, it is. At the moment, I'm tense just trying to give it over and to just give a little bit of integrity to it, because I'm not sure if I'm good enough, but I'm going to try. So Rav Yochanan, did he indeed say so? Why? Rav Yochanan said the discrete ones, and Rav Dosa said one and the same thing. And Rav Dosa clearly says whatever was picked in the past tense. Okay, so that's a problem, because if the discrete, because we know whatever Rav Dosa says, the discrete ones say. We know that from the Gemara and Ma'aser Sheni. So if that's the case, and we know Rav Dosa's wording is whatever was picked, it means they say it at the end of the day, and according to Rav Yochanan, you can't say that because you don't have possession of the goods. You can't forgive what's not in your possession. Okay, so we want to know that how does this actually work? So it was taught in a brisa. Rav Yehuda says, now don't confuse Rav Yehuda with Rav Yochanan. So Rav Yehuda makes a statement and says, in the morning, the owner of the field stands and says, whatever the poor will gather today shall be ownerless. Okay? And Rav Dosa says towards evening time, he said, whatever the poor gathered shall be ownerless. Okay. So the problem is, we see that Rav Yehuda agrees with Rav Yochanan, but the problem is with Rav Dosa and the discrete ones, because Reish Lakish is using the discrete ones and Rav Dosa as a proof against Rav Yochanan. It doesn't matter if Rav Yehuda agrees with it. Does that make sense? That's in essence the problem. So what did we discuss afterwards? That we then talking about a different issue here. This one with Rav Yehuda and Rav Dosa is actually a different Mishnah, and the Mishnah is in Peah, chapter 6, verse 5. As Kevin quite rightly said, it's the corner of the field that you leave to the poor. But so one of the gifts to the poor that a Jewish landowner must give is a leket. It's known as a gleanings because it's whatever is left over during the harvesting, right? So you've got your turbines, etc., and your tractors, etc. So the ears of grain that fall to the ground during harvesting that aren't collected by the machinery or the devices, etc. If they're 2 ears of grain, that's known as leket and can be left to the poor, but 3 are not, according to Beis Hillel. So we're learning that if 1 or 2 ears of grain fall, they are leket and they belong to the poor. If, however, 3 ears fall together from the harvester, they are not leket and remain the property of the owner. And as I said to you yesterday, just remember, it's not like 3 fall or 4 or 5 fall and the poor keep it and they give away the rest. No, it doesn't work like that. It counts what falls. You don't take 2 and then give the rest. If 2 or less fall, it belongs to the poor. If more fall, it has to go back to the original owner. Okay? So the problem is many poor people don't know that. They might be uneducated and are not familiar with the halacha. And then they take the 3 ears that fell together. So the owner therefore declares ownerless all the ears that the poor people gather. And Rashi says the reason is that the owner obviously doesn't want the poor people to unwittingly transgress the prohibition against stealing. Okay, Tosfot adds another comment, and he says the landowners also do not want the poor to transgress the prohibition against eating tevel, which is untithed produce, because the poor person who takes the 3 ears thinking that they are leket will eat them without separating the tithes. So the tithes are gifts for the poor that are basically are exempt from tithes. Okay, but if the 3 ears are not leket because it belongs to the landowner, then not only is it a case of stealing, as Rashi said, but they're unwittingly subject to tithings. So the owner therefore exempt those ears from tithes by basically declaring them ownerless and giving them to the poor. So then it's exempt from tithes and exempt from stealing. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. But the concept is a little bit the same, but it's different according to the thieves. The concept is the same in terms of forgiveness, but it's different from the thieves because those that come in and steal your property know exactly what they're doing. That's why the statement is they can stuff themselves with food and they must be responsible for their sins. But the poor people are entitled to have it. They just don't know the halachas exactly, so they might end up mistaking. But they're not thieves. They're not intentional thieves. You know what I mean? They're ignorant. Ignorance is a different issue. But as we said yesterday, if a person consumes poison still works for them, unfortunately. So this is the issue that we're dealing with. That's my own analogy. It might be a poor analogy, no pun intended, but it's the only one I can think of, guys. Okay, so the Gemara answers, reverse the position cited in the Bryce and attribute the position of Rav Yehuda to Rav Dosa and that of Rav Dosa to Rav Yehuda. So what do we mean there is basically firstly, we must know that in contrast to Rav Yehuda, Rav Dosa holds that the declaration of ownerlessness was made after the poor had already taken the 3 ears in property. Okay? So, just as one can consecrate or sell only that which is his, so one can declare ownerless only that which is his, obviously. So Rav Dosa ruling that the owner declared the ears of corn or grain or whatever ownerless after they had been taken by the poor demonstrates that Rav Dosa holds that even after an article is stolen, the original owner's ownership is not impaired in any way. And since Rav Yochanan said that the discrete one said the same as Rav Dosa, we see that Rav Yochanan understands that the discrete ones redeemed their produce after it had been taken by the passers-by. So accordingly, we remain with the original difficulty, right? So how can Rav Yochanan rule that the original owner of a stolen article cannot consecrate it because it's not in his possession? If the discrete ones, who Rav Yochanan must follow because it's an anonymous Mishnah or the statement by Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, he holds that the original ownership is not impaired by the fact that the article is presently held by the thief. So this contradiction arises. So what's suggested here is maybe we want to switch the position of Rav Dosa and Rav Yehuda. So according to the amended version, then Rav Yehuda can be said as the one who says that the declaration was made in the evening after the ears had been taken, and Rav Dosa is the one who says that the declaration was made in the morning before the ears were gathered by the poor. So accordingly, Rav Yochanan's statement that the discrete ones and the Rav Dosa said one and the same thing demonstrates that he understands that the discrete ones redeemed the produce before it was taken, right? So the practice of the discrete ones doesn't contradict Rav Yochanan's ruling that one ownership isn't impaired if the article is stolen and not in its physical possession. So that's what's suggested by the Gemara. So the Gemara then in return asks, well, why do you choose to amend and reverse the position stated in the Brisa? Reverse instead Rav Yochanan's statement and amend it to say the discrete ones and Rav Yehuda said one and the same thing. Meaning your whole point in amending the Brisa is to enable us to say that the discrete one said whatever will be picked, guys, in the future. Okay? But why amend the Brisa to accomplish this purpose? Why don't you just leave the Brisa exactly as it is and instead accomplish your purpose by amending Rav Yochanan's statement to read that the discrete ones and Rav Yehuda, who say that the owner says in the morning, whatever the poor will gather, said one and the same thing. So in other words, if the discrete ones agree with Rav Yochanan, it doesn't even have to be that Rav Dosa does. But if we say the Rav Yehuda and the discrete ones is enough for Rav Yochanan to use that against Reish Lakish. So you can say, why don't you amend it in that fashion? So the Gemara says, look, you're still sitting with the problem because it's anyway insufficient if the Brisa is not reversed. Okay. In other words, quite apart from any difficulty with Rav Yochanan's ruling, the positions in the Brisa must be reversed for a different reason. Why is that? For they said, it states that Rav Yehuda holds in the Brisa the concept of Bereira. Yet we have learned elsewhere about Rav Yehuda that he does not hold to the concept of Bereira. So just to remind you guys, Bereira is retroactive clarification, and it allows a person to implement a legal process and make its validity dependent upon events that have not yet transpired, events in the future. So it allows for the immediate designation of a personal thing whose identity or nature will be retroactively clarified at a later choice. So in other words, now you designate from a group or from a person or an object that is going to choose in the future, and you have to assign a legal status to it. But the designation takes effect immediately. And later when the choice is made, the identity of the designated becomes clarified retroactively. Okay? So accordingly, guys, the original version of the Brisa, Rav Yehuda says that the owner of the field states in the morning, when all the ears of grain are still in his possession, and he's empowered to render them ownerless, because he has them. So what the poor will gather today shall be ownerless as of now. Now the problem is, at the time of the declaration, it's unclear which ears of grain, if any, the owner is going to make ownerless, because it hasn't transpired how much is going to disappear or be taken. So nevertheless, Rav Yehuda maintains that if the poor do eventually take more ears than they are entitled to, we employ the concept of retroactive clarification to establish those ears that were taken, but they're presently unidentified as being ownerless as of now. In other words, you forgive it in advance, even though you don't know how much is going to be taken. So the problem is if Rav Yehuda makes a statement about forgiving something that's going to happen in the future, it's fine if you hold by the concept of Berera. But the Gemara says, let's put Rav Yochanan's issues aside with Reish Lakish. Let's look at Rav Yehuda and see if he holds by the concept of Berera, because we see in some parts of the Gemara he does, and in some parts of the Gemara he doesn't. So in other words, we look at the Gemara and say, are there inconsistencies between the rabbinic opinion? And if there are, either there's something wrong with our understanding, or it's what you call situational application. Meaning, if you're a rabbi, you might give two different pieces of advice to two different people. You might say to one person, listen, full-time learning is for you, and it's fine because the guy comes from a wealthy family, right? But another guy that can't scrape 2 cents together, that's got a wife and 8 Haredi kids, you might say, listen, maybe call our learning in the evening or early in the morning before you do a day's worth of work, will pay for overhead. Now, it's not that you're inconsistent with your views as a rabbi in terms of your hashkofa and what you believe. It's that the situation requires different solutions. So in this particular solution, it seems like Rav Yehuda agrees with the concept of Berera, retroactive clarification, because you need that. I can't say I forgive you of anything that's going to be stolen if I don't know what you're going to steal. You see what I'm saying? Unless you apply that principle. So if he applies it, all is good, but we learned elsewhere that he doesn't apply it. So we need to go now to that other contradicting Gemara and figure out what's going on here. Okay, so what? So there's a Mishnah in Demei chapter 7 verse 4. I've never heard of it, but I just want to explain to you what it's about. So how do you say it, Kevin? Kuthians or Kathians or
Kutim, yeah, I think it's Kutim. Yeah,
Kutim.
so is it demai? Is it the produce that's like the meisid in that? Is that what you're saying?
Okay, so I'll tell you what the issue is. This is going to come up again and again. The Kutim were a foreign tribe brought by the Syrians to the land of Eretz Israel. Okay, we learned this in Sanhedrin, Gavin. So there's a whole argument that was their conversion genuine or not. Okay, because they converted to Judaism, but it was in response to an outbreak of attacks by wild animals in the part of Eretz Israel in which they settled. So in the second book of Kings, chapter 17, it said they were being mauled by these wild animals, and they converted to Judaism in order to stop being lion. I'm just going to mute you, Gav. Sorry, mate. I understand.
Sorry.
So, in other words, the whole issue is, how do you deal with Kutim? Do you treat them like Jews halachically in terms of your commercial arrangements, etc., or do you treat them like non-Jews because is their conversion genuine? So at the heart of the matter is that if you converted for other reasons, is it still a genuine conversion? Because they did convert. In other words, are they Jews? And you treat them halachically like Jews? Or is it considered like a forced conversion because of the circumstances, and you treat them like non-Jews in terms of halacha? That's at the heart of any of these disputes. Even, Gavin, we learned this in Sanhedrin. And how did we learn this? We learned this, there were cases of theft. Do we apply the non-Jewish law to them where there's a death penalty, or do we apply Jewish law to them where there's no death penalty for theft, etc.? You know, there's complicated issues. But in this particular case, in the view of this Tana, of this Gemara, their conversion was valid despite their questionable motives. This is in response to the 25th daf of Gittin. Okay, so they consider Jews, and they produce on their land wines and fruits, etc., and they have to be treated like produce grown on the land of any other Jew living in Eretz Israel. So that means it's subject to the obligatory teruma and maisa ties. So the Kutim didn't fully observe the Torah laws, even when they converted, and they did not in general observe the laws of teruma and maisa. So you could say, well, then that's a problem. So one who purchased produce from them was obligated to assume that they didn't separate Teruma and Maisa, and you had to do it. But according to Tosfot, he maintains that the Kutim did observe those laws for themselves, but they didn't observe it in regard to produce sold to others. Whereas the mainstream Jew separated it before he'd even sell it to others. Do you get what I'm saying? Whereas the Kutim would separate it for themselves, but not in a commercial transaction. So just the safekeeping default position is you can buy from them. I mean, look, it was recorded in Chulin, in the sixth daf, that the rabbis eventually issued a decree prohibiting the wine of Kutim, because some Kutim were discovered to be involved with idol worship. But anyway, this brisa permits Kutim wine because it was taught prior to the decree when the Kutim were actually observing things much better. So what's this about? So basically, we're learning that in this case, Rav Yehuda doesn't support the concept of Bereira, but he does as far as what we learned in the previous concept of the discrete ones with the poor. So let's learn a case where he doesn't believe in retroactive clarification. Okay, so I'll give you. So let me just say what the Gemara and Mishnah says. It says, one who purchases wine from the Kutim at the onset of Shabbat should say the following: the 2 lugin that I will eventually separate after Shabbat from these 100 lug of wine are hereby designated as teruma as of now. The 10 lugim that I will separate are designated now as Maisa Rishon, and 9 lugin are designated now as Maisa Sheni. Okay, so what's happening is that there are 3 things that have to happen. You have to have 2 lugin, which is approximately, there's 2 lugin that you have to separate from 100 lug of wine, which means it's about 2%, right? And that is your first separation, okay? And that's designated as teruma, and you're making that future statement that you're going to do it later, but that rule is that you're declaring this designated as of now. Then you have to do the same thing with Maisa Rishon. You've got to take 10 lugin after the initial teruma has been separated. So in other words, what's left? So you've got like, you've got 98 lugin of wine left because you separated the 2 for teruma. Now you take from 98, 10 lugin from that, okay? So that you've got 88, and then you take Maisa Rishon. So the 10 lugin, is Maisa Rishon. Then you've got your second thing, which is your Maisa Sheni, which is 9 lugin of that. Okay, so what happens is he deconsecrates the Maisa Sheni by transferring it onto coins. Remember we said about desanctification? Okay, so in other words, unlike teruma and Maisa Rishon, Maisa Sheni can be released from its special status by transferring the sanctity from the produce onto coins. So Rabbi Meir permits postponing the physical separation of the teruma and Maisa Rishon because the person is unable to remove it at their time. Why? Because we learned that it's at the time of Shabbat. So what happens is, let me just explain this to you, is that if you buy wine during the Beis HaMikdash time, or I tell you what, you buy wine, if you there's a twilight period that there's certain things you can't do. So in other words, you can't make retroactive clarifications when Shabbat is coming. That you can't do. But there's a twilight period that you can do it at where you're not sure if Shabbat has begun or not. Okay, and at that point, Shkia, that's exactly what I was looking at. So Shkia is, in other words, you don't have time to physically separate it because Shabbat's going to come in like 10 minutes. But you've got enough time to make the declaration. That's how it all began. So what you're doing is now is you've ran out of wine for Shabbat. You find a Kuthian or a Kutim or whatever the word is. And what happens is you say, I want to buy your wine, but now you can't drink it because you haven't separated these things on a physical level. So you make a declaration that as soon as Shabbos comes out, you're going to do your separation. And what that does is it allows you to say, listen, what's left in the wine that I've drink, I will separate it in this particular fashion for teruma. The primary Maisa Rishon, and then Maisa Sheni, the second one, and then the Maisa Sheni you can deconsecrate with coins, but the others you have to leave the wine separate. But you can't create separations in the barrel now because it's just before Shabbos. So that's retroactive clarification to make that statement because you can't do it now. So otherwise you wouldn't be able to drink the wine, guys. You can't drink. You can only drink it, Gavin, when it's chulin, when it's basically meant for ordinary use. So once you've separated what's holy, only then does it become accessible for normal use. Does that make sense?
But Damon, but if there's not enough time to separate it because it's shkia,
that's exactly.
And where's the exception that the guy can drink it? And he says that
that's
an
exactly
exception.
Barera. In other words, you make the declaration. You can't drink all of it, guys. That's the thing. You can drink.
You have to leave.
But you have to leave. But
you're
not going to be able to measure or create distinctions at that point. So you make a retroactive clarification. I'm going to separate this for teruma, this for Maisa Rishon, this for Maisa Sheni, and take the coins for the Maisa Sheni, but separate the wine so you're not drinking it. So you can do. You're saying in the future you're going to do it, but you're doing that in order to drink the wine now. So we say, just hang on one sec, Kev. So the words of Rabbi Meir is saying that it's Bereira is allowed for the principle for us to consider that he will eventually separate as being already designated as of now, that he separated Truma and Maisa, and the remainder is permissible wine. It's chulin. Those are the words of Rabbi Meir, but Rav Yehuda, Rav Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon prohibit doing so. So evidently, Rav Yehuda in this case does not hold by the concept of Bereira. Therefore, he could not have been the one who says in the previous brisa that the owner of the field declares in the morning before the poor began gathering the ears, whatever the poor will collect today shall be ownerless. Hence, we must reverse the opinions of Rav Yehuda and Rav Dosa in the brisa. Okay? Now, just so you know, by the way, apparently the reason that Rav Yehuda, Rav Yossi, and Rav Shimon prohibit doing so is because they do not hold, in this case, the concept of retroactive clarification. So we can't say that he can drink now the wine as if it's chulin until it's actually physically separated. Okay, so we're seeing in this case that he doesn't agree with the principle of Bereira, and we say in the previous case he did. So obviously, unless we can find a reason why in this case it was a separate issue, we have to go back and say, well, then he didn't say that. He didn't say in the beginning of the day, I will forgive what's stolen, because you don't know what's stolen yet. Does that make sense? So then he would say afterwards, I've forgiven what has been stolen, and Rav Dosa would say, I will forgive what will be stolen. And then we can say that, great, if Rav Dosa and the discreet ones agree, there's no problem then with Rav Yochanan. I'm just saying that's how the argument's going to go. So the Gemara persists. They say, look, before you go and reverse the opinions of Rav Yehuda and Rav Dosa, apart from Rav Yochanan's views, because we have to come before about Rav Yochanan, we got to see what's happening with Rav Yehuda and Rav Dosa. All right, guys, we've got a minute left. I think we can end off on this point. I don't know if you thought this year was decent.
Yeah, excellent. So you explained Breira, that you see, you explained the lugim and the wine, and the Breira creates, it allows people to drink the wine because
correct,
you can't do the malocha on Shabbos, basically, and otherwise you won't have wine.
For sure in Shabbos, but during twilight you can, but there's not enough time to actually practically get it done if you've got 10 minutes. You've got to measure and separate and create partitions and all sorts of things. There's just no time. But if Shabbos has come in, Breira doesn't work. It's only before, it's during that twilight period, if you're in desperate need.
Damon, can I make it? That was a
Good job.
grape shear.
That was a grape shear. Thank you.
Gavin, did you get that?
I think the fruits of my labor of preparing were worth
Absolutely. No, kol hakavod.
Thank you
Arthur,
for that pun.
Arthur, just have you benched Gomel, Arthur, after your accident? You must. Have you done it?
Yeah, you must, Arthur.
Oh, did you? Good.